Walmart. The name brings to mind endless aisles, bustling shoppers, and the promise of convenience under flickering fluorescent lights. For most, it's a place of mundane errands, a quick stop for groceries or late-night essentials. But for others, it's the backdrop of something far more sinister. From eerie encounters with unknown stalkers to unexplainable events that defy logic, these walls have seen their share of horror. Beneath the hum of checkout scanners and the murmur of midnight shoppers, darkness lurks. Sometimes it's the unsettling feeling of being watched. Other times it's the sudden realization that someone or something dangerous hides in plain sight. These are more than urban legends or fleeting nightmares. These are the chilling true stories that happened in the most ordinary of places. So the next time you wander through those aisles, remember, not all nightmares happen in the dead of night. Here are 5 true Walmart horror stories that will make you think twice before your next late-night run. It began as just another shift at Walmart, a day like any other. I had just stepped out onto the floor for my first pick run of the day when I found myself in the soda aisle. The cart was a challenge. I was wrestling to fit a box of beer into it when a man approached and offered to help. He looked to be in his early to mid-20s, shorter than me, and slightly stocky. His dark corn t-shirt caught my eye, and I thanked him for his help, mentioning that I liked the shirt. He smiled, complimented my hair, and went on his way. It seemed harmless, a fleeting interaction with a polite customer. 15 minutes later, I was crouched on the floor in the soup aisle, scanning can after can of Dinty Moore. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me." The words caught me off guard. Few customers ever used manners. I stood up to find the same man from earlier. He explained that he couldn't find the baking soda and wanted to make sure he was searching in the right area. Coincidentally, my next item to pick was in the baking aisle, so I offered to show him. We walked over together, and I pointed out the baking soda. He grabbed a small box and lingered nearby, scrolling on his phone while I continued picking. I thought it odd that he hadn't moved on but brushed it off. Maybe he was texting someone, or perhaps he felt awkward that neither of us had left the aisle. Throughout my next pick runs, I kept catching glimpses of him. A figure lingering at the edge of my vision, always a little too close for comfort. By my break, his presence had become unnerving, but I convinced myself it was just coincidence. After all, the store was massive, and navigating it could be overwhelming for some. Later, during a produce run, a notoriously chaotic section, I spotted him again. This time he stood near the corn display, an image that struck me as both absurd and unsettling. It was now 1:30, meaning this man had been in the store for over an hour and a half, yet his cart contained only a few items. I avoided eye contact and focused on bagging onions and weighing apples, hoping he wouldn't approach. But he did. He greeted me with a casual, "Hi," and I asked if he needed anything. What followed was a chilling monologue I'll never forget. "I just wanted you to know," he began, "that you don't need to eat salad if you don't want to. You don't need to lose weight. If you're trying to impress that guy you were talking to, you should go for someone who would love you for who you are, not someone who wants to change you. You are so beautiful." I froze, clutching the bag of apples in disbelief. My thoughts raced. How did he know I ate salad on my break? And why would he think I was trying to impress anyone? The absurdity of his assumptions was overshadowed by the sheer audacity of his words. I told him firmly that his comment was inappropriate and that he should speak to customer service if he needed further assistance. I made it clear he shouldn't be entering employee-only areas like the break room. He looked genuinely shocked, as though my response was uncalled for, and I hurried to tell my manager what had happened. The rest of the day passed uneventfully until I stepped outside to retrieve a large order from the main parking lot. There he was again, sitting on a bench near the entrance. A chill ran through me, and I refused to take out any more orders to that area. By the time my shift ended, the sky had darkened, and the rain had begun to fall in a light drizzle. The air was damp and cool as I walked to my car. As I unlocked the door, I saw him approaching. My heart sank. He started talking again, but this time his words were sharp and laced with anger. I cut him off, telling him he'd been following me all day and that I was uncomfortable. I told him I was off the clock and had no interest in speaking with him further. He had no reason to bother me. His expression shifted to something between outrage and wounded pride. Fine, he spat. I won't ask you out. I thought you were different, but you're just like every other girl. I couldn't help but ask what he meant. I thought you were cool, he said, his voice rising with frustration. Not many people around here would understand me, but I guess I was wrong. Then, as if to punctuate his words, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small switchblade. The blade glinted faintly in the dim light, but it was unimpressive, tiny, almost comically so. My fear morphed into disbelief. Here was a man who had stalked me for hours, followed me to my car, and now stood threatening me with a blade so feeble it couldn't harm much of anything. I didn't wait for him to say more. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving him standing in the rain. I haven't seen him since, but I work almost every day. It's only a matter of time. A couple of months ago, I had an experience that still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. I was grocery shopping with my mom at Walmart, just an ordinary errand on an ordinary day. We walked in together, weaving through a few aisles as we chatted, but eventually we decided to split up to save time. I needed to pick up a few personal items, so I told her I'd call when I was done. At first, everything felt normal. I grabbed a cart and started making my way through the store, checking my list and absent-mindedly browsing. But somewhere along the way, I started to feel off. It was subtle at first, like the faint pressure of eyes on the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, assuming I was just being paranoid. But then I started noticing them. Two men. They weren't shopping. I could tell that much right away. They weren't carrying a basket or pushing a cart. No groceries, no items in hand, nothing. And yet, every time I turned down a new aisle, they seemed to appear. At first, it felt coincidental. Maybe they were just wandering the store like I was. But then I started testing it. I made unnecessary loops through different sections of the store, doubling back or turning into completely unrelated aisles. I even went into areas I didn't need anything from: electronics, sporting goods, automotive, just to see if they'd follow. And they did. No matter where I went, they were there, lingering at the edge of my vision or passing by just as I turned the corner. By the time I reached the garden center, my chest was tight with anxiety. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was all in my head. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable, and the way they moved, calculated, deliberate, made my stomach churn. I decided to approach one of the garden center employees. My voice wavered slightly as I asked about garden pots, trying to sound casual. In reality, I just wanted to be near someone else, someone who might notice if things escalated. I thought maybe the sight of me talking to an employee would spook the men, make them think I was about to say something. The employee led me to the pots, and I lingered there, pretending to browse. But the men didn't leave. They stayed in the garden center, pacing near the exit or walking past the aisle I was in. I peeked around the shelves, my heart pounding in my chest. The way they moved felt calculated, as if they were trying to seem casual but failing miserably. And that's when it hit me. They weren't shopping. They hadn't been the entire time. Who spends this long in a store without picking up a single item? I couldn't stay there forever. Summoning what little courage I had left, I decided to head to the self-checkout. As I made my way back through the store, I quickly texted my mom, explaining that I thought I was being followed and telling her where I was heading. When I reached the checkout area, I started scanning my items, trying to focus on the task and ignore the mounting panic clawing at my chest. Then I made the mistake of looking up and froze. One of the men was standing in the clothing section, directly adjacent to the self-checkout. He wasn't even pretending to shop. He was leaning on a rack of clothes, arms crossed, staring straight at me. His expression was cold, predatory, and unblinking. I felt the air leave my lungs. Worse, he was holding his phone in his hand. The way he angled it, it looked like he was pointing it right at me. Was he taking pictures? Recording me? My mind raced. Was he texting the other man? Telling him I was leaving? Where was the other man? My thoughts spiraled into darker places, each one worse than the last. I stalled. My hands shook as I scanned my items slowly, pretending to fumble with the barcodes. I called my mom and whispered everything, my voice trembling. She told me she was on her way to the checkout, and I clung to that tiny shred of hope. The man didn't move. He just kept watching me, his phone still in hand. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fought the urge to run. And then finally my mom arrived. She walked up beside me, her presence grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. And just like that, the man turned and left. No hesitation, no glances back. He was gone. We hurried out of the store together, and I scanned the parking lot, my heart racing with every step. I half expected to see them lurking between the cars or pulling up in a vehicle, but they were nowhere to be seen. We got into the car, locked the doors, and drove off, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror the entire way home. Even now, I can't stop thinking about it. The way they followed me, the way he stared at me, the feeling of his cold gaze. I don't know what they wanted or what might have happened if I'd been alone, but I'm grateful I didn't have to find out. And I've learned to trust that feeling, that primal, instinctual dread, because it might be the only warning you get. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I decided to take a break from work. Back then, running errands in the middle of the night didn't seem unusual to me. I worked the graveyard shift, and my tasks for the evening were complete except for one issue. I needed floppy disks to back up my work. This was long before cloud storage and cell phones. It was a different time, and technology felt almost primitive. I headed to the nearest Walmart. The store was quiet, nearly deserted, the kind of silence that amplified every small sound. After grabbing the discs I needed, I wandered over to the toy section, thinking I could use the opportunity to browse for Christmas gift ideas for my son, nieces, and nephews. As I walked through the aisles, I felt it, an unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced around and saw 3 men standing nearby, their eyes fixed on me. Their stares were unsettling, cold, and calculating, and their pale, unhealthy complexions made them look as though they spent their lives in shadows. I turned away, trying to shake the feeling, and continued browsing. But no matter where I went in the store, they were there. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps they were just shopping and happened to be heading in the same direction. Yet every time I turned around, they were watching me, always close but never saying a word. As I observed them more closely, my unease deepened. They were dressed in heavy coats buttoned up to their necks despite the mild November weather. The temperature outside was in the mid-50s, and I was comfortable in just a jean jacket. Their attire made no sense unless they were concealing something dangerous. I decided it was time to leave. I made my way to the registers, my mind racing. If no other customers were around when I left, I resolved to ask the cashier to call security and request an escort to my car. As I approached the front, I saw the men standing just inside the doors, muttering among themselves. Then, as if on cue, they walked outside. Relief washed over me when a man and woman lined up behind me at the register. They appeared to be minding their own business, and I decided to use them as a shield. After paying for my items, I lingered near the doors, pretending to fiddle with my buttons and blow my nose, all the while keeping an eye on the couple. When they headed for the exit, I followed closely, keeping just a few steps ahead of them. My truck was parked nearby, but as I approached it, my heart sank. The 3 men were in a car parked nose to nose with my vehicle, waiting. They watched me as I reached my truck, and I felt their stares burrowing into me. Quickly, I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel with clammy hands. The couple I had followed walked past and got into their car a few spaces away. They drove off, leaving me alone with the stalkers. I didn't move, my eyes fixed on them. After a tense minute, the driver said something to the others, started the car, and slowly pulled away. I watched as they exited the parking lot, their vehicle ascending the nearby interstate overpass before disappearing onto the ramp. Even then, I didn't start my engine. I waited, heart pounding, scanning the parking lot for any sign they might return. When I finally felt it was safe, I started my truck but didn't drive straight back to work. Instead, I took a long, circuitous route, eventually pulling into a dark lot behind a strip mall. There I killed the engine and lights, watching the road for any suspicious vehicles. After several tense minutes, my pulse began to steady. Certain I wasn't being followed, I returned to the office. Though my nerves were frayed, the memory of that night stayed with me, a lingering unease I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't until 3 months later, while watching the local evening news with my husband, that the truth was revealed. The faces of two of those men appeared on the screen. They were wanted for a string of armed robberies. That night, I realized how close I had come to something terrible. The heavy coats, the way they stalked me through the store, their ominous presence, it all made sense. To the men who followed me through Walmart that night, I hope our paths never cross again. It was Black Friday, a night of chaos and crowds, a time when people scrambled to snatch up deals under fluorescent lights. My fiancé and I had decided to brave the madness, drawn by a heavily discounted printer and some Christmas gifts we wanted to snag. The plan was simple: split up, grab what we needed, and meet back by the printer display. As I wandered the aisles, checking off items on my mental list, I felt the weight of the holiday rush. People brushing past, carts rattling, and the faint buzz of the store's overhead speakers. By the time I returned to the printer display, I pulled out my phone to text my fiancé and let him know where I was. I positioned my cart just outside the aisle to avoid blocking anyone. That's when I noticed him. A man behind me stopped, seemingly to snap a picture of the printer display. Polite as always, I stepped out of the way, figuring he was capturing details for later. But something about the way he lingered struck me as odd. His phone stayed up, the camera still open, his movements hesitant. He didn't browse the products or move along like most people would. Instead, he hovered there, looking around as though waiting for something or someone. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe he was just indecisive. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him turn toward a rack of boys' boxer briefs. He raised his phone again, the screen tilted toward the display, and I swear I heard the faint click of a camera. Except, it didn't look like he actually took a picture. It was like he was pretending. That's when the alarm bells started ringing in my mind. I decided to test him. I moved toward another aisle, pretending to browse, all while keeping him in my peripheral vision. He followed. I turned a corner, hesitated, and doubled back. He mirrored me again. My heart began to race, my skin prickling with every step he took behind me. Finally, I stopped dead in my tracks and turned to face him. He walked past me a few steps, then stopped too, feigning interest in the printer display again. Our eyes met briefly and he looked away, pretending not to notice. By now my instincts were screaming. Something wasn't right. My hands trembled as I dialed my fiancé, keeping my voice loud and clear. "Hey, where are you? I'm at the printers," I said, hoping the man would hear and back off. Instead, he moved closer, his phone still in hand, camera open. I watched in disbelief as he bent down to grab a printer box, angling his phone so the camera pointed directly at me. His finger hovered over the volume button, the telltale sign of someone snapping a picture. He didn't even try to hide it. He must have realized I'd caught on because he suddenly straightened up, smiling nervously. "Oh, excuse me," he said, laughing awkwardly as he gestured toward an older woman trying to pass by. "Looks like someone's in the way." His voice was too chipper, too forced. I decided I couldn't let this slide. After the man walked away with the older woman, I followed her and apologized for holding her up. Then, summoning all my courage, I confronted him. "Excuse me," I said firmly, my voice shaking despite my effort to sound calm. "Were you taking pictures of me back there?" His reaction was instant and explosive. He spun around, his face twisting with anger. "What? Are you crazy? What's wrong with you?" He snarled, his voice rising with every word. "I don't even know who you are, you psycho. Go to hell." People in the aisles turned to stare as he continued his tirade, cursing me out, calling me names, and waving his arms dramatically. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "If you didn't take any pictures," I managed to say, "then just show me your phone. Prove it." That's when he really lost it, screaming obscenities and daring me to call the cops. He stormed off, disappearing into the maze of aisles. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My legs felt like lead as panic consumed me. I clutched my phone, still connected to my fiancé, and gasped out the words, "Clothes by the registers. I'm by the clothes." By the time he found me, the man had returned, yelling again, this time at my fiancé. Security arrived, and not long after, so did the police. They searched his phone, but there was nothing there. No photos, no videos, Not even anything in his recently deleted folder. But I knew what I saw. Even now, hours later, the image of his phone camera pointing at me haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, hear his voice, and feel the suffocating weight of fear all over again. I'll never know what he planned to do with those photos, or if they even exist anymore. But one thing is certain, I'll never set foot in that Walmart alone again. Walmart was the last place I wanted to spend my night, but my mom needed a ride, so there I was. She worked there, and for weeks she'd been telling me about this one creepy coworker who'd been harassing her. The guy was a walking stereotype of Billy Badass, all bark, but with a streak of menace that made your skin crawl. He'd been making inappropriate comments to her, dropping thinly veiled threats when he found out she was widowed and that my brothers and I were struggling after Dad passed. He even went as far as claiming he could whoop us. Real tough guy. She'd reported him, of course, but Walmart management seemed content to let it slide. Typical. That night, I dropped her off and came back later to pick her up after her shift. We had plans for a range day with my friends the next morning, so I already had my holster on under my heavy Carhartt jacket. I'm a licensed concealed carrier, but I rarely carry outside of hunting or the range. That night, though, I had a feeling. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just the stories my mom had been telling me. Either way, I wasn't taking chances. When I pulled up to the store, I saw him. He was standing just outside, cigarette in hand, glaring at us like he'd been waiting. The tension in my mom's face was immediate. She handed me some cash and asked me to grab a few things inside while she waited in the truck. I nodded, zipped up my jacket to cover my holster, and headed in. The moment I walked through the sliding doors, I felt it, a prickling on the back of my neck. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but every aisle I turned down, there he was. His footsteps were just far enough behind to seem coincidental, but his presence was anything but. His glare was sharp, his lips curled into a smug snarl like he was daring me to notice. I tested him, weaving through random sections, taking unexpected turns. It didn't matter. He followed every time, his movements deliberate and unbroken. I stopped in one aisle, pretending to examine some random item, and he lingered just at the edge of my vision, watching. To confirm my suspicions, I stopped near a younger female associate, striking up some meaningless small talk about a product. She was friendly enough, but her eyes kept darting past me toward him. Her discomfort was palpable, and I knew she could feel it too. He wasn't just watching me, he was sizing me up, and he was holding something in his clenched fist. I couldn't see what it was, but the tension in his body made my stomach churn. I didn't stick around. I grabbed what I needed and made my way to the checkout. Even then, I felt his eyes on me. As I left the store, the cold night air hit my face, and I saw my mom sitting in the truck. She unlocked the door, but before I could climb in, I heard it. The deliberate thud of boots on pavement, closing in behind me. I turned, and there he was, marching straight toward me. For a second, I forgot that my jacket was unzipped, my holstered firearm visible. His eyes locked onto it, and his bravado evaporated in an instant. He stopped mid-stride, his expression twisting into a mask of surprise and uncertainty. "Excuse me, can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pounding in my ears. He didn't answer. Instead, he spun on his heel and hurried toward a rusty old truck parked a few rows away. From inside, I saw the glow of a cigarette as he lit up, but his eyes never left us. He was waiting, watching. My mom's voice shook as she told me to get in the truck. I slid into the passenger seat, pulling out my phone and keeping my eyes on him. My mom started the engine, but the moment she pulled out, he did too. His truck trailed us as we exited the parking lot. The tension in the car was suffocating. My mom gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Without warning, he sped up and swerved in front of us, cutting us off before tearing down the highway. We thought it was over until we saw his truck again, parked on the side of the road just a few miles ahead. Every instinct in me screamed that this wasn't a coincidence. My mom floored it, speeding past him without a second glance. When we reached a gas station, she pulled in and locked the doors as I got out to pump gas. Every shadow in the lot felt like it could be him, lurking, waiting. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my nerves on edge until we were back on the road. That night when we got home, I called Walmart's night manager and laid it all out. I didn't hold back. If I see that guy again, I told them, or if my mom is harassed one more time, I'm suing this store and everyone responsible for letting it happen. The manager seemed shocked, but I didn't care. I was done playing nice. The next morning I followed up. The staff assured me he'd been fired and banned from the property. My mom came home later that day looking relieved for the first time in weeks. He's gone, she told me. They fired him this morning. The nightmare ends. Or does it? Walmart is a place where people from all walks of life cross paths, a hub of ordinary routines and harmless encounters. But as these stories have shown, not all visits are as mundane as they seem. Beneath the bright lights and the seemingly endless shelves lies the potential for unsettling, even terrifying experiences. Whether it's the lurking stranger, the unshakable feeling of being watched, or an encounter that defies explanation, these stories serve as a chilling reminder. Horror doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it follows you through the aisles of a brightly lit store. The next time you step into Walmart, pay attention to the things that feel just a little off, a glance that lingers too long, a figure that seems to follow, or an unsettling silence in a busy space. The ordinary can become extraordinary in the most unexpected ways. Until then, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that start where you least expect them.